A year after burying his beloved German shepherd, grieving widower Walter Hayes walks into an animal shelter, only to freeze when a scarred, broken dog lifts its head. The moment their eyes meet, the impossible becomes real. Shadow is alive. But the reunion is just the beginning, because the dog who came back is not the same one Walter lost, and the truth of where he's been will shatter everything Walter thought he knew about second chances. The morning air in Briarwood was crisp and still, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns just before the world wakes up. Walter Hayes moved slowly down the familiar sidewalk, his worn boots scuffing against the pavement with each measured step. At 67, his body carried the weight of years, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hands rough from decades of work, but it was the grief that made him feel truly old. A year had passed since Shadow's death, and yet the absence of his German shepherd still clung to Walter like a second shadow, heavier than the first. The house, once filled with the sound of paws clicking across hardwood and the warm weight of a dog resting at his feet, now echoed with silence. Walter turned onto Maple Street, where the Briarwood Animal Shelter stood nestled between a hardware store and an empty lot. The building was unremarkable, peeling blue paint, a sagging awning, a rusted sign that squeaked in the wind. But to Walter, it had become a refuge. Volunteering there had given him a reason to get out of bed, a way to fill the hours that once belonged to Shadow. As he pushed open the front door, the familiar chorus of barks and meows greeted him, a cacophony of need and hope. Sarah Bennett, the shelter's manager, looked up from her clipboard and offered a tired smile. "Morning, Walter," she said, her voice warm but edged with concern. She was young, too young, Walter often thought, to carry the weight of so many abandoned lives, but she had a steadiness about her, a quiet resilience. Her smile faded as she took in Walter's face, the shadows under his eyes deeper than usual. "Rough night?" she asked gently. Walter shrugged, his calloused fingers tightening around the strap of his old canvas bag. "Just one of those days," he murmured. He didn't elaborate, but Sarah understood. She had known Shadow, had seen the way the dog had trotted at Walter's heels like an extension of himself. Today would have been Shadow's 12th birthday. Sarah's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Walter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how much you miss him." Walter swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply nodded and turned toward the row of kennels, where a dozen hopeful faces pressed against the bars, tails wagging. He forced himself to focus on the tasks ahead, feeding, cleaning, comforting, anything to keep the memories at bay. But as he reached for a bag of kibble, a sound cut through the shelter's usual noise, a high, desperate whimper, raw with fear. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "That's the new one," she said. "Came in late last night, German shepherd. The poor thing's been through hell. We can't even get near him yet." Walter's hands stilled. A German shepherd. His chest ached, but something deeper than grief tugged at him. "Mind if I try?" he asked, his voice rough. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing. "He's terrified, Walter. I don't know what he'll do." Walter met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I'd like to try." Without waiting for an answer, he walked toward the isolation kennel at the back of the shelter, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in a long, long time. Walter moved slowly down the narrow corridor of the shelter, the distressed whimpers growing louder with each step. The isolation kennel at the back was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear. When he reached the last enclosure, his breath caught in his throat. Crouched in the far corner, pressed against the cold concrete wall, was a German shepherd, his golden-brown fur matted and dull, his ribs visible beneath a patchwork of scars. The dog's amber eyes darted wildly, whites showing as he flinched at every sound. His entire body trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper, a terror so ingrained it seemed part of his very bones. Walter knelt carefully, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. He'd seen this kind of damage before, not just the physical wounds, but the invisible ones. The dog's ears flattened as Walter approached, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Walter didn't retreat. Instead, he softened his voice to a murmur, the same tone he'd once used with Shadow. "Easy, boy," he said, extending his hand just beyond the bars. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." For a long moment, nothing changed. Then, impossibly, the dog's growl tapered off. His nostrils flared as he caught Walter's scent, and something flickered in those frightened eyes. Not recognition, not yet, but a fragile curiosity. The trembling eased just slightly. Walter held perfectly still, his pulse loud in his ears. Behind him, Sarah hovered uncertainly. "Walter, I don't think—" But then the German shepherd lifted his head. Not in aggression, not in submission. It was something else entirely, a hesitant tilt of the muzzle, as if he were straining to see Walter more clearly. The dog's tail, tucked tightly between his legs, gave a single, tentative wag. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. "My God," she whispered. Walter's throat tightened, because in that moment, he saw it too. The way the dog's ears twitched forward at the sound of his voice, the way his body language shifted, ever so slightly, from terror to something like wary hope. It wasn't just any dog in that kennel. Walter knew it with a certainty that defied logic. "Shadow," he breathed. The reaction was instantaneous. The dog, Shadow, let out a broken whine and lurched forward, pressing his muzzle against the bars. His tail wagged harder now, thumping against the kennel floor in a staccato rhythm of disbelief and joy. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking. "Walter, the timeline doesn't—" But Walter wasn't listening. His fingers trembled as they closed around the latch. The dog he'd mourned for a year was alive, and he was coming home. The latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the shelter. Walter barely had time to register Sarah's panicked warning before the kennel door swung wide. Shadow exploded forward in a blur of matted fur and desperate energy, his paws skidding on the concrete floor as he launched himself at Walter. The impact knocked the old man backward, his elbows hitting the ground with a jolt that sent pain shooting up his arms. For one terrible second, Walter saw Sarah's horrified expression. She was already moving, ready to pull the dog away. But then Shadow's rough tongue dragged across Walter's cheek, again and again, his entire body racked with trembling whimpers. Walter wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, his fingers sinking into the familiar scruff as sobs tore through him. The smell of Shadow, that particular mix of earth and musk beneath the stench of neglect, flooded his senses. "It's you," Walter choked out, his voice breaking. "God almighty, it's really you." Shadow pressed closer, his nose buried against Walter's collar as if trying to memorize his scent, to confirm this wasn't some cruel dream. His tail beat wildly against the floor, each thump a punctuation mark to their reunion. Sarah stood frozen, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. Tears streaked down her face as she took in the scene, the way Shadow's scarred paws kneaded against Walter's chest like a puppy's, the way Walter's gnarled fingers carded through the dog's fur with a tenderness she'd never seen from him before. The shelter around them had gone eerily quiet, the other dogs sensing the shift in the air, this moment too sacred to interrupt with barking. Dr. Martinez arrived within minutes, summoned by Sarah's frantic call. The vet's sharp intake of breath when she saw Shadow's condition, the healed fractures she could feel beneath his matted coat, the old burns along his flank, spoke volumes. But her professional assessment faltered when Shadow, who had snarled at every stranger's touch for days, allowed her to examine him without protest, so long as Walter kept one hand on his head. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Martinez admitted, her stethoscope pressed to Shadow's ribcage. "These injuries. Walter, he shouldn't have survived." Walter's grip tightened on Shadow's collar as the dog leaned heavily against his leg. The truth settled over him like a weight. The accident a year ago hadn't killed Shadow. Someone had taken him, someone had hurt him, and through some impossible twist of fate, he'd found his way back. As Dr. Martinez prepared a sedative to help Shadow rest, Walter pressed his forehead against the dog's. "You're safe now," he whispered, the promise rough with tears. "I won't let go again." Shadow's answering sigh seemed to carry the exhaustion of 1,000 lonely nights as he finally allowed himself to collapse into the safety of Walter's arms. The drive back to Walter's farmhouse took twice as long as usual. Shadow lay stretched across the back seat of the old pickup truck, his head resting on Walter's thigh, his breathing shallow but steady. Every few minutes, Walter would glance down, his fingers automatically finding their way to the spot behind Shadow's ears that had always made the dog sigh with contentment. The reaction was the same now. Shadow's tail gave a feeble thump against the seat, his eyes drifting shut, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, painting stripes of gold across Shadow's scarred coat, illuminating the patches where fur might never grow back. Neighbors had gathered on their porches as Walter's truck rumbled down the dirt road leading home. Word had spread faster than Walter expected. He saw Mrs. Callahan from the general store wiping her eyes with her apron, old Mr. Peterson leaning heavily on his cane as he watched them pass. Walter didn't stop to explain. There would be time for that later. Right now, all that mattered was the weight of Shadow against him, the way the dog's nose twitched as familiar scents began filtering through the open window, the wild mint that grew along the fence line, the rich earth of the vegetable garden Walter had neglected this year. When the farmhouse came into view, Shadow stirred. His head lifted, ears pricking forward as the truck rolled to a stop in front of the sagging porch where they'd spent so many evenings together. Walter cut the engine, the sudden silence heavy with anticipation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Shadow let out a soft whine, his claws clicking against the door as he scrambled upright. Walter's hands shook as he unbuckled his seatbelt. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. In his dreams, Shadow would come bounding up the steps like he used to, bursting through the front door with his usual exuberance. But the dog that stepped onto the gravel driveway moved differently now. There was hesitation in his steps, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He paused at the bottom of the porch steps, his body trembling as he sniffed the air. "It's okay, boy," Walter murmured, coming to stand beside him. He didn't reach for Shadow's collar. This was a choice the dog needed to make for himself. Shadow took the first step, then another. By the third, his tail began to wag. Slow at first, then with growing confidence. When he reached the top, he turned to look at Walter, his amber eyes bright with something that looked like disbelief. The screen door creaked as Walter pushed it open, the sound triggering something deep in Shadow's memory. With a sudden burst of energy, the dog bolted inside, his nails skidding on the hardwood as he raced from room to room, rediscovering every corner of the home he'd lost. Walter stood in the doorway, watching as Shadow investigated the kitchen, nosing at his empty water bowl still sitting by the fridge. The dog paused at the foot of the stairs, always afraid of them as a pup, before finally making his way to the living room. There, beside the stone fireplace, sat the faded red dog bed Walter had never been able to bring himself to put away. Shadow circled the bed once, twice, then sank down with a groan that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. His chin came to rest on the edge, his eyes fixed on Walter as if to say, "I remember." Walter crossed the room on unsteady legs. He lowered himself to the floor beside the dog bed, his back against the hearth, and ran a hand down Shadow's side. The rise and fall of the dog's breathing beneath his palm was the most beautiful thing he'd ever felt. Outside, the first fireflies of evening began to blink in the gathering dusk, their tiny lights mirroring the stars just beginning to appear above the farmhouse. "Welcome home, Shadow," Walter whispered. And for the first time in a year, the house didn't feel empty at all. The morning after Shadow's return, Walter woke to the sound of soft whining and the press of a cold nose against his palm. He opened his eyes to find Shadow standing beside the bed, his tail wagging tentatively, his ears flicking forward and back with nervous energy. It was a scene that had played out hundreds of times before, Shadow waking him at dawn for their morning walk, but now everything was different. The dog's movements were stiff with lingering pain, his once glossy coat dull and patchy in the pale light filtering through the curtains. Walter reached out automatically, his fingers finding the familiar spot behind Shadow's left ear, and felt the jagged ridge of a half-healed scar beneath his touch. Their first walk was nothing like the rambling hikes they used to take through the woods behind the farm. Shadow stayed close to Walter's side, his body tense at every unfamiliar sound, a bird taking flight, a branch cracking underfoot. When a squirrel darted across their path, Shadow didn't chase it. He flinched, pressing himself against Walter's legs with a low whimper. Walter knelt in the dew-damp grass, running his hands along Shadow's sides, murmuring reassurances until the dog's breathing slowed. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." But the words felt hollow in the face of whatever horrors Shadow had endured. Back at the house, Walter filled Shadow's old food bowl with the special blend Dr. Martinez had recommended, something gentle for a stomach that had gone too long without proper meals. Shadow approached the bowl cautiously, sniffing at the kibble before looking up at Walter with uncertain eyes. "Go on, boy," Walter encouraged, his voice thick. It wasn't until Walter took a piece and pretended to eat it himself that Shadow finally began to eat, his movements hesitant at first, then desperate. Walter had to pull the bowl away to keep him from making himself sick, his heart breaking at the way Shadow immediately cowered, as if expecting punishment. The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. Mornings began with Walter checking Shadow's wounds, applying salve to the worst of them, while the dog lay patiently on his side. Afternoons were spent on the porch, Shadow dozing in the sunlight as Walter worked through the pile of mail that had accumulated over the past year, bills he'd ignored, letters from well-meaning friends he'd never answered. Sometimes, when Walter thought Shadow was asleep, he'd catch the dog watching him with those amber eyes, full of a quiet devotion that made Walter's throat tighten. At night, the real challenges came. Shadow's nightmares were violent things, whimpering, thrashing episodes that left them both shaken. Walter began sleeping on the couch so he could be closer to Shadow's bed by the fireplace, reaching down to soothe the dog whenever he cried out in his sleep. One particularly bad night, Walter gave up on sleep altogether and carried Shadow outside, wrapping them both in an old quilt on the porch swing. They sat there for hours, Walter humming the same tuneless lullaby he'd used when Shadow was a pup, until the dog's trembling subsided and his breathing evened out against Walter's chest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Shadow began to heal. The day he finally chased a rabbit through the tall grass, halting after just a few yards, but chasing nonetheless, Walter laughed so hard he cried. When Shadow brought him a slobbery tennis ball one evening, dropping it at Walter's feet with a hopeful wag, Walter felt something long dormant stir in his chest. He threw the ball until his arm ached, until Shadow collapsed panting at his feet, his tongue lolling in canine contentment. The transformation wasn't just in Shadow. Walter found himself standing straighter, smiling more easily. He started tending his garden again, planting the tomatoes Shadow had always loved to steal straight from the vine. Neighbors began stopping by, first out of curiosity, then genuine concern, and finally with offerings of homemade dog treats and well-worn chew toys their own pets had outgrown. Mrs. Callahan from the general store brought over a handmade bandana, blue with white bones, which Shadow wore with ridiculous pride on their weekly trips into town. One rainy afternoon, as Walter sorted through a box of Shadow's old things, toys he'd packed away, the red leash they'd used for vet visits, he found the collar Shadow had been wearing the day of the accident. The leather was stiff with age, the brass name tag tarnished. Walter rubbed his thumb over the engraved letters SHADOW and felt the weight of all they'd lost, all they'd somehow found again. Shadow, sensing his mood, rested his head on Walter's knee with a soft sigh. Walter fastened the collar around Shadow's neck, adjusting it carefully to avoid the worst of the scars. "There," he said, his voice rough. "Now you're really home." Shadow shook himself, the tags jingling with a sound so familiar it made Walter's breath catch. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the kitchen in gold. Walter reached for Shadow's leash, hanging unused by the door for over a year. "What do you say, boy?" he asked. "One more trip around the block?" Shadow's answering bark was all the confirmation Walter needed.